When I bought my home, I only wanted quiet. I wanted the hum of cicadas in summer, the soft flicker of porch lights at night, and the satisfaction of lowering my carbon footprint. I wanted air that smelled of grass and rain, evenings where the sound of my tools replaced the noise of traffic, and a space that felt like mine. What I didn't know was that a single decision installing solar panels would spark a suburban Cold War that would outlast the seasons and expose how fragile, peaceful communities can be when one man decides control is his birthright. My name is Ethan. I am 34, an electrical engineer who spends most days designing renewable energy systems and teaching companies how to manage power efficiently. My world is built around structure, data, precision. I measure everything: voltage, consumption, performance, silence. After years of renting small apartments with unreliable heat and flickering lights, I finally purchased a modest single-story home on a quiet corner lot. Its southern roofline was perfect for panels, broad, unobstructed, tilted like it had been waiting for sunlight. I imagined the house glowing with self-sufficiency, a small ecosystem of order and light. I didn't imagine that my new neighbor, a retired contractor named Harold Price, would decide that my roof somehow threatened his entire existence. From the outside, the neighborhood looked harmless. Every lawn was cropped to an identical height, every mailbox painted the same muted color. There were flags that never drooped, hedges that obeyed invisible rulers, driveways that looked cloned. It was the kind of order that suggested pride, but beneath it was something more brittle. Control disguised as harmony. Harold had lived there for over 20 years, and his presence lingered like the echo of a sermon. People called him particular, the polite euphemism for obsessive. He was the self-appointed warden of the block, the man who saw the street as his personal extension, the kind who counted the number of leaves in his gutter and believed the world would collapse if one was out of place. The homeowners association loved him. They called him dedicated. Everyone else called him Sir, just to avoid trouble. When I moved in, I tried to fit in quietly. I trimmed the grass, painted the fence, even used the exact brand of mulch everyone else seemed to have. For a few weeks, life felt balanced. Then the panels came. They arrived on a flatbed truck in sleek, reflective slabs. Efficient, elegant, perfectly harmless. The installers worked fast, neat as surgeons. By the third day, everything was in place. When the inverter came online, I watched the power meter spin backward and felt something like pride. That clean, precise joy that comes when effort turns into independence. For a brief moment, I believed I had found equilibrium. Then came the letters. The first envelope appeared in my mailbox 2 days later. The paper was cheap, but the tone was pompous. An official notice, printed with an invented crest and the words Neighborhood Aesthetic Council. It accused me of unauthorized roof modifications and installation of reflective hazards. It demanded immediate removal to preserve community cohesion. The letter was unsigned, stamped only with a generic seal that looked like it had been lifted from a free template. There was no such organization listed in any city record, but the intention was clear. The second letter arrived the following week, thicker and more confident, citing fines for noncompliance. The third accused me of disrupting property values and requested an environmental impact review. It became obvious that someone, somewhere, had decided that my panels represented rebellion. I tried to laugh it off. Bureaucratic bluffing, I thought. A man with too much time and a printer. But the messages kept arriving, each more theatrical than the last. My mailbox became a stage for petty tyranny, and the performance grew louder. One morning, while checking system diagnostics, I noticed a drop in output. The graph dipped sharply, like a sudden breath drawn in. One of the panels showed an irregular reading. Minor damage, maybe debris. I climbed up to inspect and found a hairline crack tracing across the glass like a deliberate stroke. 2 days later, another appeared, shallow but visible. It could have been coincidence, but experience teaches you to distrust coincidence in close proximity. I opened the security footage. The frame flickered with the pale light of dawn. There, on the neighboring roof, stood Harold, robe tied, broom in hand, sweeping pebbles from his shingles with theatrical precision. Each stroke sent debris into the air, the arc of gravel falling exactly where my panels caught the first light. In one frame, his expression twisted just enough to betray satisfaction. The video ended, but the still image remained in my mind. The smirk, the morning haze, the casual cruelty of someone who thought himself untouchable. Anger came not as an explosion, but as a slow alignment of logic. I felt it settle into me like a system coming online. Rage doesn't suit engineers. Precision does. I took notes, timestamps, angles. I replaced the cracked glass, recalibrated the inverters, and added sensors that monitored fluctuations at millisecond intervals. If there was interference again, I would know not just that it happened, but when and from which direction. I began to notice the smaller signs of escalation. His sprinklers accidentally shifted to spray across the fence line. His garbage bins migrated closer to my driveway, blocking the curb on collection days. A loose nail appeared in my tire after parking on the street overnight. None of it could be proven, and that was the point. Men like Harold thrive on plausible deniability, feeding on irritation rather than confrontation. They believe frustration is a leash, but I've never been the type to pull back. Instead of reacting, I observed. I documented. I built a record as methodical as any experiment. The first phase of a problem is always diagnosis. The second is design. I began drafting a plan that didn't rely on emotion, only cause and effect. Every time he looked over, I smiled. Every time he adjusted his hose or pretended not to stare at the panels, I logged the weather, the time, the light angle. What he didn't understand was that every system eventually reveals its weaknesses. His was predictability. Weeks passed. The panels continued to produce quietly and flawlessly. I spent evenings on the porch watching the data stream across my laptop screen. Voltage, temperature, efficiency, harmony. There was something meditative about the numbers. They told me the truth when people didn't. My house glowed faintly with stored sunlight, and I began to find comfort in the knowledge that even under pressure, energy seeks balance. Harold, meanwhile, seemed to unravel. He paced the street more often, inspecting lawns that didn't need inspection, finding imaginary faults. I could feel his resentment radiating across the property line like heat. He couldn't stand that something worked without his approval. The suburban calm remained intact for everyone else. Laughter, sprinklers, the smell of barbecue drifting through the evening air. But beneath it pulsed an undercurrent of quiet hostility, a conflict made of glares and silence. Every night I checked the footage again before bed. Every morning I ran diagnostics. The system never lied. And as summer slid into early autumn, I realized that my little patch of roof had become more than an energy project. It was a mirror reflecting how absurd control can look when it loses its audience. I didn't speak to Harold again after that. There was nothing left to say. The war he had started had become one-sided. A man shouting into the wind, and another quietly turning sunlight into power. Calling the police did nothing. There was no direct proof of intent. The officer's words were polite but empty, like static on a deadline. I replaced the damaged panels myself, calibrated the system, and decided that if he wanted a war of control, I would fight it through data. Emotion clouds judgment. Data never lies. I upgraded my setup with a precision inverter that recorded every kilowatt produced, stored, and distributed. Every flicker of voltage was translated into numbers, and numbers are incorruptible. For weeks, I monitored the graphs with surgical focus. Energy rose with the morning sun, dipped at dusk, then flatlined during the night, except for small, irregular fluctuations that appeared long after midnight. The readings were faint, subtle, yet persistent, like the pulse of a hidden parasite. Something was drawing power when my house was asleep. Nothing in my system explained it. I recalculated consumption, checked appliances, verified the integrity of circuits. The anomaly remained. It was as if a ghost had plugged into my grid. Precision became obsession. I began tracing wires like veins, following them along conduits and walls until they reached the property line. I dug through mulch and soil near the fence, half expecting to find nothing but roots. Instead, a line of disturbed earth led me onward, an unnatural furrow cutting through the dirt toward the other side. I brushed the soil away and found the truth. A buried extension cable, snaking under the fence like a vein of deceit, its plastic insulation still warm to the touch. The plug disappeared beneath Harold's side of the yard, right toward his detached garage. For a moment, I just stared at it, unable to decide whether to laugh or rage. The absurdity of it. His need for domination stretched so far that even my electricity had become his conquest. I felt a strange mix of disbelief and fascination. Sabotage, I had expected. Theft was evolution. Control, I realized, is never satisfied until it consumes everything around it. I photographed every angle, time-stamped the images, logged each watt diverted through the phantom line. I archived the evidence on 2 encrypted drives and printed copies for redundancy. A month passed in deliberate silence. I wanted him to think he was invisible, that his clever little crime was undetected. During that time, I reinforced the entire system, rerouted key circuits, and installed hidden load sensors. I diverted a small portion of the output into a submeter labeled Experiment A. Every night, when the rest of the street slept, I watched the phantom current feed into the buried line. The pattern was regular and predictable, the electrical equivalent of a heartbeat. I learned his schedule through electricity. The line would awaken at 1:17 a.m., peak around 3, then vanish at dawn. It was almost intimate, an unwanted connection between us measured in watts instead of words. While he dreamed of authority, he was literally feeding off my energy. The irony was perfect. Then came the night of the test. The sky was cloudless, the air humming with the quiet intensity that precedes resolution. From my workstation inside, I watched the readings rise again at their usual hour. The phantom load activated, siphoning current like a leech. I waited 5 minutes, then executed a remote command that rerouted the current back into the inverter and shut the buried line down. On the monitor, the graph plunged into nothingness. 10 minutes later, through the closed windows, I heard it. The sputtering roar of a generator jerking to life next door, followed by the faint stutter of failure. I noted the time, the duration, the decibel level. Proof complete. I slept for the first time in weeks. The next morning the sky looked different, wider somehow. I spent the day assembling my report. High-resolution photos of the cable, wiring diagrams, power logs, summaries of current flow, voltage drift, load ratios. Every claim was cross-referenced and indexed. My documentation was cleaner than most doctoral dissertations. When I submitted the file to the city's code compliance office, I expected bureaucracy to grind slowly. Instead, the response came almost instantly. My report had the one quality bureaucracies admire: precision. Inspectors arrived without warning that same week. I didn't watch the confrontation. I preferred numbers to noise. But I saw their van parked at the curb, saw the orange notice later taped to Harold's garage door, and that was enough. The violation citation gleamed under the afternoon light like a small sunrise. Word traveled quickly. The neighborhood thrives on gossip disguised as civility. Some whispered that inspectors had found illegal electrical modifications. Others that Harold's garage nearly caught fire. I neither confirmed nor denied anything. The truth needed no help from me. Still, the satisfaction was quieter than I expected. Victory rarely comes with trumpets. It comes with paperwork filed correctly. Losing control did not humble him. It corroded him further. Within days, retaliation began in small performative gestures. He flooded the real Homeowners Association inbox with complaints about my panels, how they produced glare hazardous to drivers, how they supposedly interfered with aircraft navigation, how they endangered local wildlife. Officials came, inspected, and left unimpressed. Each dismissal chipped away at his credibility, but the effort continued. Obsession has its own inertia. His new campaign turned physical. Trash bins began appearing in front of my driveway on collection mornings, perfectly aligned to block the exit. Cars parked inches from my mailbox, conveniently forgotten for days. His sprinklers rotated just enough to spray across the walkway whenever I passed by. It was an art form of pettiness, crafted from the small cruelties of suburbia. Yet I refused to engage. Silence, when wielded correctly, becomes its own fortress. Patience is often mistaken for weakness, but it is the sharpest weapon of all. Every action he took became another entry in my log, another line in a file that grew thicker by the week. I didn't retaliate. I recorded. My cameras saw everything: the bins, the water, the midnight pacing. He wanted chaos. I gave him structure. He wanted reaction. I gave him data. It was a battle fought in parallel realities. His, driven by emotion, and mine, built on documentation. Sometimes I would sit by the window late at night, the glow of the inverter casting blue light across the room. The graphs moved slowly, breathing like a living thing. Outside, the neighborhood slept in the false comfort of order, unaware of the quiet duel unfolding in its midst. I thought about the nature of obsession, how control consumes those who practice it. Harold had become the embodiment of entropy disguised as discipline, his need to dominate leading him deeper into disarray. I realized I didn't even hate him anymore. Hatred requires energy, and I preferred to conserve mine. As weeks slipped into months, the tension transformed into a pattern as predictable as the cycles of daylight. The panels absorbed the sun, stored it, and gave it back to the grid. The system was self-sustaining, elegant, immune to drama. Harold, on the other hand, burned through his own reserves. Each failed complaint, each ignored letter, drained a little more of his authority until only stubbornness remained. The community began to see through him, the way one eventually sees through a bad mirror. One morning I found his front lawn uncharacteristically untrimmed, the grass a shade too long. It was the first visible sign of surrender, though he would never admit it. The same day, my system's output graph displayed a perfect curve, steady, uninterrupted, efficient. Numbers never lie. By then, I understood that this wasn't simply about stolen electricity or cracked panels. It was about the illusion of control and what happens when it meets the quiet persistence of logic. Power, both literal and figurative, had shifted. His was dwindling, consumed by resentment. Mine was renewable. The panels kept turning sunlight into order, and in their silent hum I found peace. Now, when I walk outside at dusk and see the panels catching the last amber light, I think about that buried cable still somewhere under the soil, severed but symbolic. It reminds me that energy, once claimed, always finds its rightful owner again. The neighborhood hums, unchanged on the surface, but every watt of power flowing through my home carries a small echo of that battle. A quiet record of patience triumphing over pettiness. Weeks later, a stroke of luck changed everything. The tension that had hummed beneath the surface of our small community finally found its outlet in something as ordinary as an HOA open forum. I attended out of curiosity, not strategy. By then, I had learned to expect little from bureaucracy, and even less from people who spoke in circles about community, cohesion. But fate has a strange sense of humor. It hides resolution inside the very systems that once failed you. That evening, the folding chairs were arranged neatly in rows across the community center floor, the air smelling faintly of coffee and dust. I sat near the back, half listening to routine updates about landscaping budgets and pet waste regulations. Then I met Mara Lewis, the association's secretary, a quiet woman whose calmness felt like gravity. When I mentioned the fabricated committee letters and the stream of fraudulent notices, she frowned, her pen freezing mid-sentence. She promised to check the official records. I didn't expect much, but a week later she reached out. According to the association's files, Harold had been formally removed from all HOA committees a year earlier, after an incident of verbal abuse toward another homeowner. Yet he had continued to parade around the neighborhood pretending to be a board member, wielding fake authority like a badge. He'd been signing letters using stolen stationery, stamping them with outdated seals, and distributing them as if law itself bent to his will. I gave Mara my documentation, the entire archive of photos, time-stamped logs, and every piece of false correspondence he'd shoved into my mailbox. The evidence spoke louder than anger ever could. She thanked me quietly, her expression unreadable but firm. I knew, as I handed over the folder, that the storm had already begun to turn. The next community meeting took place in the park behind our houses, beneath a canopy of oaks that filtered the late afternoon sunlight into golden stripes across the grass. Children played nearby, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the growing tension among the adults. I didn't plan to speak. I only wanted to observe the truth reveal itself. Mara stood near the front, her voice steady but unyielding as she presented the findings. She explained, line by line, how Harold had falsified authority, issued bogus fines, and intimidated residents under the guise of neighborhood preservation. The sound that followed wasn't outrage, it was recognition. a long, collective exhale that carried years of quiet resentment. For the first time, the neighborhood saw Harold without his disguise. The man who had appointed himself guardian of perfection, who had walked the sidewalks like a self-declared sheriff, was nothing more than an imposter with a printer and a taste for control. The people who once tolerated him began to remember their own humiliations. Warnings for mailbox height, fines for shades of blue too cheerful, citations for lawn ornaments that dared to be unique. The park buzzed with murmurs that swelled into open discussion. It was as if sunlight had finally touched a place long hidden under the shadow of fear. When my turn came, I didn't need to raise my voice. I connected my portable screen to the projector and displayed the data from my monitoring system. The chart filled the canvas of daylight. A timeline of power generation, clean arcs of energy output interrupted by precise spikes of theft. The evidence glowed in vivid color, undeniable, elegant. I didn't speak a word. The pattern spoke for itself. Each stolen watt traced back to his property like a fingerprint carved in light. The silence that followed was the kind that reshapes understanding. Then softly at first, laughter broke through. It wasn't cruel. It was cathartic. The absurdity of it all, the man who preached discipline caught stealing electricity from the person he harassed, was too much to contain. Laughter gave way to applause, and applause turned into something weightier. Liberation. The Homeowners Association voted to impose penalties and permanently bar Harold from any future involvement. The decision passed without debate. Just like that, his empire of petty authority dissolved. Afterward, I felt no rush of triumph, only stillness. The air seemed lighter, less charged. Sometimes the end of conflict feels less like victory and more like a room finally exhaling. A week later, his wife left a note in my mailbox, short, written in an unsteady hand, apologizing for everything that had unfolded. I read it once, folded it, and placed it in the same folder that had once contained my evidence. I didn't respond. Some endings are better left in silence, preserved as lessons rather than reopened as wounds. In the months that followed, the neighborhood began to shift in subtle, beautiful ways. The manicured perfection Harold had enforced with intimidation softened into humanity. Lawns grew slightly uneven, fences sprouted colors other than beige, porch lights flickered at irregular intervals. People lingered in driveways longer, speaking without glancing nervously at their surroundings. Children drew chalk art on sidewalks that once would have earned a citation. The air itself felt freer. Freedom, I realized, has texture, uneven, unpredictable, but unmistakably alive. I expanded my solar array, adding new battery storage, and a small interactive display beside my porch that showed real-time energy generation. The kids from nearby houses came by often, pressing their hands against the glass to watch the numbers climb. Their laughter replaced the mechanical drone of Harold's lawnmower, which hadn't been heard since. The symmetry of it all felt poetic, light replacing noise, curiosity replacing fear. Months passed. One afternoon, I received a message from a journalist at the local paper. They were writing a piece about renewable energy projects and wanted to feature my system as a model of sustainability. I agreed, on the condition that the article focus on education rather than conflict. When the piece came out, the headline read, "Engineer turns sunlight into justice." The photo captured me standing beside the panels as the setting sun glinted across the tempered glass. In the background, Harold's house stood darker than the rest, its porch light conspicuously unlit. The article circulated modestly online but traveled farther than I expected. My inbox filled with messages from strangers, people in other neighborhoods who had fought their own battles against petty authority, small-minded HOAs, or vindictive neighbors. They thanked me not for the outcome, but for the method. Calm persistence, factual precision, and refusal to descend into chaos. I realized then that the story had outgrown me. It had become a quiet anthem for those who believed that order could exist without oppression. Sometimes I think about that first day I moved in, the naive optimism, the belief that civility guarantees peace. It doesn't. Civility can coexist with tyranny when fear keeps it polished. What maintains peace is boundary. The invisible line where you decide that your dignity cannot be negotiated. Patience protects that boundary. Knowledge reinforces it. And when necessary, law becomes the sunlight that sterilizes what festers in the dark. Revenge, I learned, doesn't always roar. It hums softly in circuits, flows through cables, and turns daylight into proof. It doesn't destroy, it illuminates. Every kilowatt hour my system generates feels like a reminder that control can never overpower understanding. My panels don't just power my home, they record a history written in light. At dusk, when the panels cool but still shimmer with residual warmth, I often sit outside with a cup of coffee and watch the automatic systems take over. The batteries shift to night mode, the inverters hum, and a single lamp positioned at the edge of my property flicks on. I wired it intentionally, a small beacon facing Harold's fence. It glows softly, powered entirely by the excess energy my system produces. Sometimes I imagine him noticing it through the blinds, wondering if it draws from his grid or mine. The answer, poetic and absolute, is that in a way it powers his house still. Only now by my design, on my terms. Peace has returned, but not the fragile kind born from submission. This is a sturdier peace, built from knowledge, law, and the quiet understanding that no one dictates the light. The neighborhood learned something vital. Control collapses when met with clarity. I learned something too. That sunlight, in its silent persistence, exposes everything eventually. Whenever someone complains to me about nosy neighbors or overreaching associations, I tell them the same thing. The best revenge doesn't shout or threaten. It is patient, meticulous, and perfectly lawful. It gathers evidence instead of anger. It measures, it calculates, it waits. And then, when the moment is right, it simply shines. Because nothing unsettles a control freak more than realizing the thing he tried to destroy is the very thing lighting his way home.